I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mack Payne.
This is Mack Payne here with episode 1778 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. I don't know about you, but on this day of June the 26th, 2020, I'm getting tired of hearing about nothing other than the COVID-19 84 virus and the anarchy that's sweeping across the nation, where apparently there are a lot of people out there intent upon destroying our country. I feel sorry for those people because they're going to find out the same thing that Robespierre found out back in the 1700s when the French had their revolution and the Jacobins wanted to change everything, just like the anarchists are trying to do in this country today. Over in France, back in those days in the 1700s, they gained control of France, cut off a few people's heads, and then Robespierre took over. They kept doing all these things, like they even changed the number of days in the week, that type stuff. They just wanted to change everything. And just like it always happens, the pendulum goes too far in one direction, and then somebody like Napoleon comes along and straightens them out. We all know what happened then. So to help get our mind off all that stuff, I want to talk about an aircraft that was used in the Vietnam War. It was a Douglas A-1 Skyraider. There's a point about the use of this aircraft in Vietnam that reminds me of Vietnam veteran Ron Irwin's book, titled 5150 Book. Ron tells me that in police lingo, that means somebody's gone crazy. And he always hated those calls because when you go out on a 5150, that means you have to deal with some wacko who's doing crazy things. That's why he named a book about his time in Vietnam with that name, 5150, because there were so many crazy things going on. I advise you to get a copy of that book because it's on the recommended reading list for this podcast. Thinking about that book reminded me of this aircraft, the Douglas A-1 Skyraider, that was used in Vietnam. I'm going to take a second look at that aircraft in this podcast. I'm doing that because the use of this aircraft indicates one of the 5150s of the Vietnam War. On my second tour over there, I had the privilege of flying Cobra gunships that were designed specifically for the Vietnam War environment. It was a war where we were engaged in guerrilla tactics. We were operating those Cobra gunships in a fairly unsophisticated environment. We were up against weapons like 50 caliber machine guns and larger caliber. When we were flying there were no guided missiles or heat-seeking missiles and all these other things that could really cause you problems. It was fairly unsophisticated there. But in this environment of fighting these guerrillas who were crawling around in jungles and hiding in holes in small numbers here and there, we were using F-4 fighters, F-105s, B-52s against these unsophisticated little guys who were fighting us with booby traps, AK-47s. But we were using these sophisticated aircraft. No matter how fast and powerful and expensive an F-4 is, when it flies in low and slow to drop bombs on the enemy, you can knock those things down with a BB gun. And I would see these aircraft go down over there all the time and think, why are we doing this? We're wasting a lot of money on these aircraft. Then one day we were flying out over Laos during Lam Son 719er. Suddenly I saw a propeller-driven aircraft fly by. I thought, wait a minute, I'm in a time warp. I'm back in World War II. Turned out it was an A-1 Skyraider, probably one of the best aircraft in that war as far as fighting a guerrilla enemy. And yet we're sending out F-4s and 105s and all these other sophisticated aircraft to shoot at guys hiding in a hole. So I believe that is an example of something else that should be in Ron's book, 5150. To get our minds off all these things in the news today, I'm going to share a story with you about this outstanding aircraft that appeared on the National Interest website. The title of it is Douglas A-1 Skyraider. This old-looking plane was a Vietnam War warrior. This is what I said about it back in episode 870 that was published on April the 1st, 2017. I quote, "Back in the olden days of 1970 and 71, I had the distinct privilege of being allowed to fly an AH-1G Cobra gunship in the Vietnam conflict. As a member of A Battery, 4th Battalion, 77th Field Artillery, Aerial Rocket Artillery of the 101st Airborne Division, I flew in many high-intent situations where we were rockin and sockin members of the oppositional forces on the ground. We flew out of our home base at Phu Bai, near the old imperial city of Hue, that was surrounded and protected by its St. Augustine-style fortress walls. I guess the ancient Cochin people really did believe in walls. We operated in areas like the A Shau Valley, Khe Sanh, Laos, and both sides of the DMZ, to name a few. Many times our activities involving hostile action would include the participation of fast movers, that is, jet aircraft, from other services including the Air Force, Navy, and the Marines. The aircraft included everyone's favorite, the F-4 Phantom, the F-105 Thud. I think that name was picked because of the sound they made when they crashed, which was frequent, and the A-7 Corsair. One day, in the midst of some intense action, I noticed a strange-looking propeller-driven aircraft participating in the combat melee. It strangely looked like a World War II attack aircraft lost in a time warp. That unusual plane turned out to be the Douglas A-1 Skyraider. That's how I introduced the Skyraider 3 years ago. I'm going to share this national interest story with you because you never can say enough about the A-1 Skyraiders. Unfortunately, that was the aircraft that dropped the napalm on the little village where some of the children got burned and one of them was running out along the road. The napalm had burned all their clothes off and everybody thought, oh, we were terrible. They don't seem to mention that that plane was being flown by South Vietnamese pilots. Putting that aside, let's take a look at the good things the A-1 Skyraider did over there in Vietnam. Again, the title of the story I'm going to share with you is Douglas A-1 Skyraider. This old-looking plane was a Vietnam War warrior. This story was submitted by none other than Peter Sushi. Peter, if I'm mispronouncing your name, please accept my apologies. It's spelled S-U-C-I-U, so I'm pronouncing it sushi. Let's take a look at what Peter had to say about these fabulous aircraft. Dateline National Interest website. Described as a flying anachronism, the single-seat Douglas A-1 Skyraider, affectionately known as the Spads, after the French wood-and-wire World War I fighter, proved that a piston-powered, propeller-driven attack aircraft still had a place in the jet age. The aircraft, which entered service in the late 1940s, provided close air support for American and South Vietnamese troops during the Vietnam War. What made the aging warbird so successful was its ability to carry an immense amount of weapons, coupled with its ability to stay over the battlefield for extended periods of time. The Skyraider provided close air support to ground forces, attacking enemy supply lines, and even protected helicopters during rescue missions by patrolling the skies while being able to quickly strike at enemy units on the ground. That's right. Many times those Skyraiders would accompany us as we flew out on CNN missions. We don't exactly know where we went or what we were doing. We were just there to provide air support, and the Skyraiders were there many times to help us, which we appreciate. Something else about those Skyraiders, it seemed like they could go out and stay on station for like days at the time. Jets would come out and they'd be there 10, 15 minutes and they say, well, sorry guys, we got to go in. We're running low on fuel. But those Skyraiders, they could stay there all the time. Continuing. While it played a crucial role in Vietnam, the Douglas A-1 Skyraider was designed during World War II for the U.S. Navy. It arrived after World War II ended, but during the Korean War, the Skyraider became the backbone of the U.S. Navy and USMC strike aircraft sorties. Its large weapon load and 10-hour flying time even surpassed the jets of the era. The Skyraider also had the distinction of making the only aerial torpedo attack of the Korean War when the U.S. Navy dam busters, flying from the USS Princeton, conducted a daring raid on the gates of North Korean-held Wachon Dam. However, by the late 1950s, the Skyraiders, which were the last tail-wheeled airplane in the Navy inventory, were largely considered relics. Piston-powered fighters in the age of jets. And while the fighters had performed well in Korea, the Navy looked to replace them with jet aircraft. As the United States became involved in Vietnam, it was apparent that the fastest jets could not always get the job done. But the Skyraider seemed perfectly suited for fighting against the guerrilla-style war that was being waged by the Communist Vietnam forces. In 1961, U.S. Air Force instructors began to train South Vietnamese pilots at Bien Hoa Air Base with former Navy Skyraiders. But it wasn't long before those instructors took part in combat missions. That's the most exciting thing that can happen to someone training to fly Skyraiders when you go into actual combat and bust hell out of the enemy guys on the ground. Continuing. Other combat missions for the Skyraiders included hunting truck convoys up and down the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos and Cambodia. Now get this. The standard combat load during the war was 4 high-intensity parachute flares, 800 rounds of 20-millimeter ammunition, 2 19-shot 2.75-inch rocket pods, and a mix of 4 250 and 500-pound bombs. For the pilots, it must have been an old-school experience as there was no onboard radar, no infrared or night vision aids. I can tell you from my experience flying in a Cobra gunship, you didn't need all that stuff. With those low and slow-flying aircraft, you go out there and do combat with the enemy mano-a-mano. Forget all that electronic stuff. That would come later. In later wars, as things got more sophisticated, Cobras no longer flew around and would aim at the targets. Cobras no longer flew around in the air and would find targets and then aim at them. Now they hover behind trees 10 miles away. They pop up, fire a missile, then go back down behind the trees and guide it in on their screens. That may be efficient, but that won't give you the thrill of firing at targets where they're shooting at you and those red tracers are flying by you and you shoot back at them and then those red tracers stop. As Winston Churchill said, that's the greatest thrill in the world. Continuing with the story. From 1945 to 1957, Douglas Aircraft built approximately 3,180 of the Skyraiders in 7 basic versions, and it proved to be an extremely versatile aircraft that found uses long after it was considered a relic or even obsolete. That's the end of Peter's story. I can't say enough about those Skyraiders. They were perfect for the Vietnam War. Many times when I'd see those 105s crash into the ground or even F-4s blow up, I would say, why are they wasting these magnificent aircraft on a bunch of guerrillas running around the jungle? Bring in those Skyraiders. They can do the job. Just for your information about Peter Sushi, who submitted this story, he is a Michigan-based writer who has contributed to more than 4 dozen magazines, newspapers, and websites. He is the author of several books on military headgear, including A Gallery of Military Headdress, which is available on Amazon. I have not seen that book, but I think it would be a good addition to the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast recommended reading list. Matter of fact, I will put a link to it on the show notes for this podcast episode, VietnamVeteranNews.com. Also, I want to remind everybody about my special offer where I'm going to be giving away 4 legacy staffs on July the 4th, one each to someone from the 4 branches that served in Vietnam: Army, Navy, Marines, and the Air Force. There's no cost, there's no obligation. All you've got to do is send me a message, email preferably, giving me your name, of course, what branch of service you were in, your rank, and when you were in Vietnam. On July the 4th, I've got 2 lovely ladies who are going to participate in a ceremony to draw 4 names out of a hat, and they're going to receive this tremendous legacy staff. I have one myself, and I can't believe what a wonderful thing it is. There's a line somewhere in the Bible that says, "My rod and my staff, they comfort me." After I got my legacy staff, I can understand how true that is. So don't delay. Get your name in, because the drawing is going to be held 1 week from tomorrow, July the 4th. I'd like to see you get one of those, whatever branch you're in. Hopefully this story about the Douglas A-1 Skyraiders that were used in the Vietnam War will get your mind off the heavy news of the day. I hope it will motivate you to go and get a copy of Ron Irwin's book, 5150. In episode 1777, there's a direct link to it where you can click on it and be reading it in no time. With that in mind, I'm going to close out this episode of 1778 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for coming to listen to these stories. You are cordially invited to come again soon and often to listen to more that will be coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?